TikTok on trial. As the social media giant heads to court for a key hearing today, we preview a community discussion on the future of social media regulation. To discuss that, we're joined by the moderator of tonight's event, Dr. Nick Seabrook. He's a professor of political science and public administration at the University of North Florida. Hey, Nick.
Good morning.
We're also joined by Julie Shih. She's an assistant professor of public administration at the school and also a part of tonight's discussion. Welcome, Julie.
Good morning.
So we were actually supposed to be joined by Cord Byrd, Florida Secretary of State. He wasn't able to be here. But Nick, remind us what is happening in federal court today.
So today we will hear oral argument before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals in TikTok's challenge to the kind of divest or ban legislation that passed out of DC earlier this year. And TikTok is arguing that this bill is illegal in a variety of different ways, but primarily that it violates the First Amendment, that it infringes upon free speech, both the free speech rights of TikTok itself as a corporation, its ability to speak to users through its platform, and its ability to engage in expression through its curation of content that appears on the site, but also that it violates the free speech rights of its users as well by denying them access to content and information on the platform. On the other side, the government has argued that TikTok poses a major national security risk that justifies those infringements on speech.
So the hearing today is before a three-judge panel in the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. This law would go into effect on January 19th unless the court rules otherwise. And it stands to impact a huge amount of people who use it, Nick.
Yeah, so according to TikTok's filings in the case, they have somewhere around 170 million U.S. users of the platform, which is getting fairly close to about half of the U.S. population. Other estimates put it in the 150 million range, but either way, we're talking about a substantial chunk of Americans who use the TikTok service. And the data also shows that it's particularly popular among younger Americans. And about a third of younger Americans get the majority of their news from TikTok. So if this lawsuit ends up with the court siding with the federal government, we could be looking at a TikTok ban in the United States beginning early next year.
And Julie, they've asked for a decision to be made in January to allow either side to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court and to provide that time if needed. But as Nick says, this could take effect as soon as January 19th if the court allows it to move forward.
Yeah.
And so this is an issue, as he said, over concerns that this app could be used to spy or influence. And to be fair, I think every app is trying to do that to some extent, right? They're collecting our data. They're trying to influence or manipulate our decisions and how we choose things or how we shop. But the stakes are higher here. This is a case that's supported by the FBI, by the FCC, and the Department of Justice calls it a national security threat of immense depth and scale. So
Yeah.
what's at stake here?
So I think TikTok is different than other like popular social media platforms here is that it is a app owned by the Chinese technology companies for 99%. The ownership, which is also have 1% of the ownership by the Chinese government or the Communist Party. So I think that is the biggest concern being raised up by the government here for the national security issue. Because yeah, sure, all other social media platforms can access to our individual data and can be a threat to the safety. But at least it's within this country that government can, fairly easier to monitor or control. But when is another nation is involved, I think it's fair to raise that security concern.
And to your point, I mean, foreign powers are not allowed to own mainstream news outlets. So Rupert Murdoch, he had to become a U.S. citizen before he could kind of take over the Fox News empire and other broadcast and publication interests. And so is there a need to update our definition of media? I mean, clearly, when you talk about nearly half the population, having this app, using this app and accessing it, it is a source of information. It is a form of media.
It is. Social media is a type of media by definition. It's different than the traditional media because, you know, usually the traditional media is more like a one-way information delivery, but social media is very different because it's a two-way communication. So the users themselves are can also be the content generators. They can also influence other people, which is compared to the traditional media. It is, the editor, in people in the industry actually control the content, generate the content. So that's the difference between social media and media, which is now because of the appearing of social media, that's changing the entire society consume information. So yeah.
And we know that it's incredibly influential, Nick. One of the concerns that's been expressed by the Department of Justice in this case is, what could happen that would allow this company to sway the political views of Americans. One thing that's come up, obviously we're in an adversarial position with China. There's been concerns if China were to invade Taiwan or in the event of a war between China and the United States. If you have an outlet that is this influential and owned essentially by the Chinese government, that it could be a powerful tool to spread misinformation or to sway people's views.
Yeah, and so we know in kind of broad general terms what the national security concerns that the US government has here. The possibility that the app could be used to spy on American citizens, that the Chinese Communist Party could access data on US users and use that for nefarious purposes. There's also the issue of misinformation as well. There have been a number of allegations that the TikTok content algorithm manipulates information, manipulates the feeds of users to push them towards particular positions, whether it's taking an anti Israel position in the recent conflict with Hamas, or suppressing information that's damaging or embarrassing to the Chinese government. But we don't know a lot about the specific national security threats that the government is citing in this lawsuit because the vast majority of that information has been redacted in the legal filings. The US has claimed that it would be damaging and dangerous to national security to reveal information on those threats publicly. And so, outside of the Justice Department, the only individuals who actually know the full scope of the government's case are the three judges who will be issuing the decision.
And ByteDance, which owns TikTok, has asked for those redactions to be removed and that information to be released. But as you say, the government's opposed it. We're talking about social media, specifically TikTok right now, which is in court today. The future of it at stake very much. And you can join our conversation at 904-549-2937, or you can email comments or questions about social media or this case to First Coast Connect at wjct.org. It's interesting, Nick, when you talk about, the influence that this um, app could have or the way that it could possibly track or interfere with its own users. And the interesting thing is that there have been some examples of this happening. Um, there was a reporter for BuzzFeed who was reporting on China. Emily Baker White, she works for Forbes now, but she had been um, tracked by ByteDance, not so much for her personal information, but because she was meeting with people that were maybe employees of ByteDance, or they suspected as much, and they were trying to triangulate where she was located, where they were located at the same time. And that's information that's been reported on. They were accessing their IP addresses and their user data, and using covert surveillance through this app. So it's not something that's abstract or possible. It's actually happened.
Yeah, and ByteDance at least claims that it has taken steps over the last few years to address some of these concerns. People may recall that this is not the first time that we've had this whole debate. Back in the summer of 2020, the Trump administration attempted to achieve something very similar, kind of this divest or ban ultimatum through an executive order, and that was ultimately put on hold by the courts, and it was rescinded by Joe Biden once he took office in 2021. But after that happened, the Justice Department and the federal government continued negotiating with ByteDance. There were discussions with US companies like Microsoft and Oracle about potential deals to sell the company. And TikTok did invest about $2 billion to move a lot of its data on US based users to servers controlled by Oracle, the parent company of Google, to provide for greater oversight by auditors, to kind of silo that data away from the broader Chinese company. I think what we saw happen earlier this year suggests that lawmakers in Congress are very skeptical that they've actually followed through on what they've promised. And certainly, neither the White House nor Congress was kind of buying the idea that this effort has adequately addressed those concerns that have been raised going all the way back to 2020.
And you kind of alluded to some negative impressions of Israel that were, believed to be spreading on TikTok, and also very pro-Palestinian hashtags that were trending. And we know that that was some information that the Congress may have been briefed on when they made this decision, concerns that this app was already being used to shape public opinion about that conflict.
Yeah, and this has been, I think, a common theme in a lot of these misinformation campaigns by foreign adversaries, that the way they go about influencing American public opinion is by promoting division, trying to pit Americans against one another and destabilize things. We saw this with the Russian interference back in the 2016 election. And we're seeing something similar now, I think, with TikTok, that to the extent that that algorithm is being potentially manipulated by the company, perhaps at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, it's to sow division and to pit Americans against one another. And it focuses on these types of divisive issues like the conflict in Gaza.
And Julie, the company ByteDance has said, there's no indication that they've been pressured by the Chinese government, that they would not intend to turn over any information. But the concern there is ultimately if they were forced to
Mhm.
by the Chinese government, they really wouldn't have any choice.
No, they don't. So all the technology companies in China has to follow, the Chinese government rule or law. They passed it in 2017, saying that if the Chinese government require a technology companies to, submitted all individual data for security reasons or for whatever the reason the government claim, the company really have to, giving all the data to the Chinese government. But I think the law default was designed for all the citizens in China. They were not really targeting on foreign citizen primarily by designing that law. Also, that China has a very different law system than United States. We don't have constitution same as here. So it is hard for a lot of technology companies to adjust their positions when they are, especially for example, TikToks are now trying to working in two different law systems. So I think that's the struggle that the technology companies are facing.
We're talking about social media and TikTok and the influence or implications social media could have on national security. We've got a message from Ed on Facebook. He says, according to Chinese law, it's illegal for any business not to fully cooperate with the government if they're asked to do so. Serious consequences if the business refused. Um, you can reach us online if you want. It's 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We've got a call from Susan. Good morning. Susan in Mandarin, go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering if your guest could tell me what the difference is between Twitter and TikTok and how we can be sure Twitter isn't doing some of the things that he's accusing TikTok of doing. And also in relation to that, I was concerned about DeSantis sending law enforcement officers to people's homes who signed a petition, because that seems related, kind of troubling. Thank you.
Interesting. Thanks, Susan. To her first point, why are we picking on TikTok here, Nick?
Well, I think there's a fair point to be made, and Julie kind of touched on this earlier, that what TikTok is doing with US based users' data, what TikTok is doing with its algorithm, with its manipulation of the things that people see in their feed. It's not all that different from what Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of these social media companies and platforms that are US based and US owned are doing. I think the reason why TikTok has been singled out is not so much that it's qualitatively different as a platform. It's simply because that it's a Chinese company, and there are national security concerns, geopolitical concerns that just are not present when it comes to Twitter. But um, it does suggest perhaps that there are broader questions about data privacy, about the manipulation of the information that we receive that we should be asking, and perhaps should be addressed by more comprehensive regulation of social media. These are some of the questions we're going to discuss at our panel event this evening at UNF.
And this really is the would be the first tech regulation of any significance in this country.
Well, we've seen increasing attempts within the last few years to regulate social media and tech companies, and Florida has actually been, along with states like Texas, one of the leaders. So, listeners may recall earlier this year that there was a major Supreme Court decision involving attempts by both Florida and Texas to regulate the way that social media companies moderate their platforms. Now, both of those laws are currently on hold and litigation is proceeding, but it does seem that outside of the specific issues related to TikTok, that social media regulation has become a much more prominent part of public policy, particularly here in the state of Florida.
Yeah, states have been trying to chip away at that with the inaction kind of at the federal level. Julie, and Florida has also passed a law that would require social media companies to terminate accounts of kids who are 14 or 15 or require some sort of parental consent.
Yeah. So I think, social media in general are targeting younger generations. It is also showing a lot of research have done on certain social medias are very addictive to young people, especially. So Nick mentioned about the users primarily on TikTok are relatively young. Actually, they are the youngest generation compared to all other social media. There were one third of the young folks on TikToks are using that daily to watch the news and then conduct all kinds of other activities. And TikTok became famous at the beginning was also because they were the first. Well, they are one of the social media platforms create this like a challenges for young people to finish. So that's in theory also make the young people more addictive to it too. Um, so um, so that's another concern that why the social media needed to be careful how they manipulate or they mobilize their users the way that how they use the social media.
And it's interesting, we were talking a little bit before the show, Julie, but this is a company that's trying to say there's no risk of this, political influence. And yet, in order to prepare for this court case, they actually enlisted their followers, their users,
Mhm.
to reach out to their congressman. And there was this enormous response, hundreds of thousands of, young people, mostly teenagers,
Yeah.
calling their congressman to complain about this law.
Yeah, I think I think it's not only TikTok. I think social media in general, having this power to mobilize their users for certain agenda, which is why it brings the concern of the TikTok because it's not U.S. owned technology companies. It's a foreign country. So the concern is fair to be raised by what if another nation is trying to using this platform to mobilize, U.S. citizens, or other nations. And I think in the world, U.S. is not the only country have this concern. In history, India, Indonesia, and all other several foreign countries also have the concern about how TikTok access to their own citizens' individual data, and how the potential Chinese government may using that to influence their nations as well. So
And we should say, I mean, social media, the Chinese government doesn't allow foreign social media companies in China, as
yeah.
opposed to them and ByteDance being allowed to operate in the United States. And so that is a little bit of a difference there. Um, so Nick, in terms of that recent mobilization of people to call their congressman, how do you think that uh, served the company as they're trying to push back on that same narrative?
Well, I don't think it helped them. I think it both served as a wake up call that got a lot of states, including Florida, to take a much harder look at TikTok and social media among younger Americans. Florida has been, as I said earlier, very active in restricting social media. TikTok is banned in all K through 12 schools here in Florida. It's banned on all state-owned devices. It's even banned on college and university campuses and devices as well. So, if I attempt to access TikTok from even my personal phone, if I'm on the UNF campus and on the campus Wi-Fi, I won't be able to access it. If I take my UNF-owned iPad, I take it anywhere, I cannot access TikTok on it because it's restricted. I certainly also think it didn't help them in the debate before Congress when Congress is kind of concerned about this question about how TikTok may be used to manipulate Americans and how that might pose a national security risk if right in the middle of that debate, TikTok gives an active demonstration of its ability to do just that.
What do we know about how some of those restrictions, like you said, security at the federal level, they prohibit their employees from using TikTok on their devices. Also at the state level here on college campuses, do we know any information about how or if that's impacted the use of TikTok?
Well, I think if you asked any of our students here at UNF whether it's restricted their ability to use TikTok, they would tell you that no, it probably hasn't. They can just disconnect from the campus Wi-Fi, and they're free to use it any way that they see fit. Now,
Hmm.
that could change if this bill is successful. And beginning January, initially, the TikTok app is no longer available in the Apple or Google stores, which means that no one would be able to install it if they don't have it already. But then moving forward, it would restrict people's ability to update the app, to get patches, to keep it functional. Now, there are various ways that you can get around that using VPNs or whatever, but then it starts to become, you have to be a little bit more tech savvy at that point. It's not a case of simply turning off your Wi-Fi. If this bill is upheld by the courts, we could see much more significant and effective restrictions than, for instance, the ones we have here in Florida have been able to do.
And this is a First Amendment issue from the perspective of the company. They're saying it's restricting their First Amendment rights, restricting their users' First Amendment rights, Julie. And to be fair, I mean, there are creators, artists that rely very much on this app to spread their message or the work that they do and to earn revenue from it.
Yeah.
So it has a potentially significant impact for them.
Yeah, but I also think that many people trying to argue that there are other type of social media platforms that having similar functions that the social media influencer or a lot of arts or companies can using those functions to attract their followers as well. So I think for like the effect that how to attract the users, that shouldn't be a major issue if TikTok is banned in this country. I'm pretty sure if it's not already happened, there are technology companies here already trying to be competitors of TikTok and try to attract, getting people's attention from TikTok already. But back on the question raised up whether that's banning the TikTok violate the uh, First Amendment of the individuals. I think there is argument down there, which is again, I think TikTok met this challenge as they are not American-owned company. So they also have to follow to another country's law system, which is that country does not have the same constitution as here.
Mm.
So if a country facing or if a company facing two type of laws, how do we know which type of law they are really truly follow?
And does the First Amendment apply to other countries?
Certainly in some countries they don't.
Yeah,
So
yeah. But it does raise the question, Nick, about, who benefits. To Julie's point, there will be other um, apps and products that go into that space, that vacuum that would be created. You know, you could see that going straight to Facebook and Meta, to YouTube and Google. I mean, certainly they would stand to benefit mightily if TikTok was banned.
Yeah, I think it kind of cuts in both directions, though. We have seen, at least within the context of the legal case, some of these American based tech companies weighing in on the side of TikTok.
Hmm.
We've seen briefs filed by companies like Meta and Oracle and others saying that this would set a dangerous precedent if this bill were to be allowed to stand. So, at least in terms of their immediate bottom line, these companies would be willing and eager, I think, to step in and fill the vacuum that would be left if TikTok were banned in the United States. But thinking more broadly, and knowing that both at the federal level and the state level, social media regulation is becoming a much more salient question, I think these US based companies are fairly concerned with the kind of precedent that could be set if the court were to say, okay, national security, data privacy concerns, these override the First Amendment rights of the companies and their users, that could open up the door to much more social media regulation of US based companies in the future.
Sure, because I would guess at some point, if it wasn't necessarily national security, I mean, there are a lot of questions about just its mental health impacts, how it's impacting young brains and creating, kind of addictive algorithms that are similar to drug abuse or gambling. And so that's something you're also going to be discussing tonight is just kind of the research that's been done on how addictive and potentially damaging apps like this can be. Is that right?
yeah. So there is research actually already show that social media in general are influencing our brain. But what is standing out, like the new social media, like TikTok, they were using the short video clip that chop the information, like long information, into pieces. So the consumers or the users will enjoy more by watching just a piece of the information instead of the whole information. And the reason they chop the information in short on purpose is trying to make it more addictive to their followers. So you watch like only a couple seconds of a piece of news and then you wanted to know more or what is the next. So that's what TikTok would stand out other than all other type of social media design in that way. The algorithm in TikTok is very different than the other of the social media as well. So the TikTok now has already updated their function. Initially, they only allow the video clip be couple seconds long. So now they allow for long video clips. But there were also research showing that if people, especially younger people, only consuming short amount of information, in the long term, their brain size can be shrinked. So there's a famous study has already published on neutral science, and the study actually conducted from China. They actually went to a Chinese university and then recruit the participants and do a comparison by a group of people using TikToks and the other group of people just watching the long type of information. And I did find out that people who using the TikTok are having trouble to remember like the whole or the full story of the entire information.
Actually changing the way that their brain absorbs information. It's fascinating. Well, tonight, the event at UNF is part of the Diverse Perspective series. It's called TikTok on Trial: The Future of Social Media Regulation. It's from 5 to 6:30 p.m. in the Andrew Robinson Theater. Dr. Nick Seabrook, Julie Shi, thank you so much for coming on and telling us about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.